So now we get to the four main types of organic molecules. One of them is carbohydrates. That's what we're going to start with. As we already said, there's four main kinds, but we're only going to really focus on three of them. We're just going to touch on nucleic acids a little bit, and later we're going to get into them in a lot more detail. So what do they want you to be able to do? And by they, again, I mean the stuff in red print from the state of Florida, EOC. Describe the important structural characteristics. Realize, again, on your EOC test, there's not going to be any description. There's going to be multiple choice tests, but within those, there's going to be descriptions, right? Of what? Now, here's what you have to, again, key into. Anything they use in the actual syllabus might show up on the test. In fact, it will show up on the test, and they expect you to know any of these big fancy words that they put in the syllabus. They expect you to know them. So here again, we see macromolecule, right? We see monomer, we see macromolecule, monomer, we see monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. Okay, so unfortunately for you, there's other words involved here that you're going to see. They might not be in the syllabus, they might, but they apply and you're going to see them. And so, for instance, here's one. Sugars are also known as monosaccharides and disaccharides. Any of those can be called sugars. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of mono and disaccharides, right? Polysaccharides, when we get to them, you don't call them sugars. So this is some vocab also we need to get used to, okay? So carbohydrate is the big umbrella. Carbohydrates include mono, di, and polysaccharides. They include sugars. They include fiber. That's another word coming up. So anyway, here we go. What makes a carbohydrate? This is what you're going to be able to need to identify, recognize, meaning they might give you a sketch of a molecule and ask you, in fact, they are going to, what is this? A, B, C, D. Is it carbohydrate, lipid, protein? Is it monosaccharide, disaccharide? Anything they told you you might have to identify, it might be by sketch, and we'll get to those in a minute. So what are you looking for in a carbohydrate? Well, its name is pretty much descriptive of what it includes: carbon and water. Not literally water stuck together, but in that arrangement and in that ratio of one carbon to every one oxygen to every two hydrogens. This is the heart and soul of a carbohydrate. If you take this and stick a bunch of them together, how many? Well, that's what that N out here refers to. It could be a whole bunch of them. It could be just a few of them. It could be literally tens of thousands of them to make one molecule, or it could be just a few. But this is the heart and soul of a carbohydrate. And you can see why it's not really containing water. This OH is not connected to that H to make a water molecule, but it is two H's and an O. It is H2O in this one carbon. Okay. The name of carbohydrates often ends in the suffix OSE, like glucose, for instance, fructose, galactose, right? But I emphasize the word often because let me think of one. Chitin is a carbohydrate that doesn't end in OSE, but it's still a carbohydrate. So anyway, to the first of these kinds of carbohydrates, the smallest, the ones that include just one kind of molecular unit, therefore monosaccharide. Saccharide is a Greek word that means sugar. That's why it became part of this, right? Sometimes these are distinguished from the disaccharide sugars with the term simple. So a simple sugar is also a monosaccharide. A disaccharide we're going to call in a minute a double sugar, okay? Many of these monosaccharides all have the same formula. And you see this ratio again of carbons to hydrogens to oxygens of one carbon for every two hydrogens to every one oxygen, CH2O, right? You see that exactly here. But there's several kinds of molecules that have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. They're just put together differently. And those kind of molecules we call isomers. Iso means the same. What's the same about them? Their chemical formula. How are they different? They're put together differently, and we're going to see examples of some in sketch form in a little bit. Okay, glucose is going to be the star of the show all year because glucose is the most common of these monosaccharides. It's the one that we commonly refer to as blood sugar in vertebrate animals like ourselves. It's the sugar, it's the carbohydrate that's mostly flowing around in your blood. Its function is to store and release energy. That is a possible question. And that energy we're going to see mainly comes from the bonds between carbon and hydrogen. Not the bonds between carbon and oxygen, but the ones between carbon and hydrogen, and we'll come back to that later. Okay, so fructose and galactose are also C6H12O6 monosaccharide simple sugars. They're just a little bit different structurally, and sometimes, as we'll see, it's just a little bit different. So now, this you are likely to get on the test in some way, shape, or form. A formula like this that's called a structural formula, right? C6H12O6 was called the molecular formula. It told you how many of each kind of atom there are. This also tells you that, if you want to count them up, but it also tells you how they're put together, so that gives you much more information. So what you notice here is a carbohydrate, this is glucose, can look like this, or it can look like this, which is quite a different look, but they're actually the same molecule. This is what it would look like if it was dry. But if you put this in water, the water starts to tug and pull on it, and it bends it around to make it actually connect and form a ring structure that looks quite different, but has all the same parts, C6H12O6. So you should be able to identify each of these as a carbohydrate. How? Look again at what they are made of mostly. CH2O, CH2O, CH2O. There's a little bit of wiggle in that, right? Not exactly CH2O, but for the most part, look at this one now. CH2O, 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 CH2O. That's what says carbohydrate. We are going to see in a little bit a molecule that has a straight chain of carbons like you see here. But it's not a carbohydrate because it doesn't have H2O attached to these carbons. It only has H's. We're going to come to them in a little bit. This is a lipid kind of thing, but it looks quite like this because it's got that chain, sometimes called a backbone of carbons. Here's something else I want you to notice. Notice that in these three pictures, they have the C for carbon. Every place there's a carbon, and they have a number by them. Organic chemists talk to each other about these carbons by number. This is carbon 1 of the glucose molecule. This is carbon 2, right? And they all know what each other's talking about because this is a standard kind of format of naming them. But you notice in this one they don't have the C's in here. This is another kind of chemical shorthand that all biochemists, and now you know, if a molecule is depicted as having an angle, I'll draw another kind of like that, an angle, it's understood that that angle is, the vertex of that angle is a carbon atom, an understood carbon atom. So that's why you don't see the C's here, but they are really still there in symbol form. Okay, so look at this one, right? Here, every angle's a carbon, like we said, every angle's a carbon. Ha! Except this angle's an oxygen. I know this can be confusing to you. And the red color in this is what, organic molecule people know, oh, that means oxygen. Red's the color for oxygen, so to speak. So here you have, can you see the difference between these two isomers? They look all the same except for right here. And notice this oxygen and hydrogen, this OH, hydroxyl, is kind of pointing up, and here it's kind of pointing down. That's the only difference between glucose and galactose, is the position of two things attached to a carbon in this one particular place. That's the only difference. But it gives them different melting points, different boiling points. They would taste differently to you. So it's enough of a difference to give them two different chemical properties. Now again, the double sugars, the disaccharides, still sugars, but disaccharides. How would two monosaccharides, like two glucoses, get put together to make a disaccharide? By dehydration synthesis. So here we see a specific example of two monomers being put together to make a dimer. All right. How would you split them apart? If this was part of your lunch, how would you split it into two monomers? Should go that way, sorry. By hydrolysis, right? Dehydration synthesis in reverse is hydrolysis. So here is that very common kind of disaccharide that we actually all our life have been calling sugar. This is that specific kind of sugar that we call table sugar. That's that white stuff that we specifically call sucrose. It's made of one glucose and one fructose. And you can see that fructose, even though it's C6H12O6 like the glucose, it's an isomer of it again, right? It's shaped a little bit differently. It's got a pentagon shape instead of a hexagon shape, but it's still got 6 carbons. One of them is just not in the ring, like 5 of them are for glucose. So this has 2 of what we call branch carbons with things attached, but it's, again, identical in its chemical makeup, C6H12O6. Okay. So now we have the polysaccharides, which get yet another vocab word for you to remember. If it's called a complex carbohydrate, that is a synonym for polysaccharide. That means it's not a disaccharide or a monosaccharide, no matter how complex you might think they are. Complex carbohydrate means polysaccharide. Okay, so almost all the complex carbohydrates in an actual living thing like you and I are simply a string of glucoses, glucose polymers that might be literally tens of thousands of glucoses long in one molecule. These are very big molecules. Sometimes you have a branch like this. Sometimes you have many branches, and that's what makes one of these polysaccharides different from another, right? But then another thing that makes it different is what their function is. We have complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, that are put together in cells like yours and mine to store energy, to get the energy from them later, to store them in cells. Those are the kind we call starches. So now here's a word that means carbohydrate, but not just any carbohydrate. Starches are not glucose. They're not disaccharides, even though those molecules do store energy. Starches are polysaccharide energy storage complex carbohydrates. And the one that you and I make to store energy is called glycogen. Here it is, right? And the ones that plants make to store energy are ones like amylose or amylopectin. Again, there's a few different ones, but they are all called starches. This is called animal starch. This is called plant starch, right? And they, again, are complex carbohydrates that are made to store energy. But here's two kinds that are made for a different purpose. They're made for a structural purpose. These molecules are going to be the building blocks of something. Something that's either part of a cell, like a cell wall, or something that's actually part of an organism, like that exoskeleton that is the part of a cockroach, for instance, that makes it go crunch when you step on it. That's its exoskeleton, made of this organic molecule called chitin. This is what we said is, again, an example of a carbohydrate that doesn't have an OSE ending, but is still a carbohydrate. And again, these kind are not called starches. They're structural carbohydrates. And none of these are called sugars because they're not mono or disaccharides. This kind of vocab stuff you just have to practice with and get used to, because all these words do have some specific meanings.